Uh, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you people who are watching the live stream. I'm Ed Merzwinski. I'm with the U.S. Public Interest Research Group Education Fund. Along with the Center for Digital Democracy, we're pleased to present this event looking at the Black Box Society with the author of the book, The Black Box Society, The Secret Algorithms That Control Money and Information, Frank Pasquale, followed by two panels, a panel of advocates and then a panel of government experts to discuss with the professor the findings of his book. I've been working on black box credit bureaus for 25 years now, and even though they are heavily regulated, they are at the point of the spear of companies that are invading your information, invading your privacy, collecting information about you and selling it to others without your consent necessarily in all cases. We're very excited about some of the work that the Federal Trade Commission and the CFPB are doing in this area, but we think a lot more needs to be done. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Frank, but first I want to thank our venue hosts, the Public Citizen, for the opportunity to use their press room. Thank you to Public Citizen for that. Frank?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ed. And it is a real pleasure to be here today. And I can't tell you enough how much I admire the work of PIRG, of Center for Digital Democracy, and of the advocates who are going to be on the panels later on today. They've really inspired me. And I think they should be inspiring a lot more academics and others and those in government to really look into the nature of big data decision-making in the future. And before I get into the bulk of my presentation, I just want to make sure everyone knows the stakes. And I think the stakes are high and clear, and they boil down to this: that if we live in a world where very important decisions about employment, credit, insurance, other vital economic factors are made by algorithms and data that are essentially black boxed, impermeable to inspection, either because of trade secrecy or because of real secrecy or just because they are hidden away, that is essentially an open invitation to regulatory arbitrage around nearly all the legal values that we hold dear, be they anti-discrimination, be they due process, be they basic fairness. And so with that, we're going to go through a lot of information about personal data. The book looks at personal data, looks at reputation, looks at search, looks at the finance sector in general. Today's presentation will focus on data because that's something that we have particular expertise from the CFPB and FTC on. And then I'm going to be talking later on about some first steps toward getting a handle on this new economy. So to begin, here is in sketch form a way of understanding just how many different types of institutions may be collecting information about individuals. And you can see that in each of these sectors, be they retail, finance, telecom, mobile, or medical, each of those has very critical roles to play in deciding, say, opportunities available to individuals, and in deciding, say, within the healthcare system, how individuals will be treated within them and how we can optimize diagnosis for them. In each of these areas, there are very positive ways in which data can be used to improve services and to improve outcomes in the field. But as we move further, it's not data collection and data analysis and use that individuals might be able to sort of conceive of and think about on a human scale within any of the individual firms in that inner circle. As the data starts getting spread out, shared, swapped, sold among lots of third parties and even fourth parties, such as the credit bureaus, data brokers, other websites, other information brokers, huge online ad networks, this becomes a spread of data that is essentially unmonitorable and uncontrollable by any individual, right? We can't, and this is the problem, and I want to introduce the problem in this way because for so long, for decades, we've been thinking about the problem of data as a problem of people cautiously, carefully noticing and then giving consent or withholding consent to certain forms of data sharing. My argument, and sort of the foundation of the argument of the book, is that in this new data environment, it's really uncontrollable. There are lots of things that you just have to do business with. You have to be on certain platforms. You just have to be there, or else you're going to be severely disadvantaged in one way or another. And moreover, this type of data flow is something that no human can keep track of. And just to give you one statistic that I think really validates that, we all have been familiar with the three major credit bureaus, where under FCRA we have rights of inspection, annotation, correction. According to a report by Bob Gellman and Pam Dixon, there are now at least 4,000 data brokers. So you could spend every day of the year going over 10 different records that are kept on you by, say, these different brokers, or at least checking if there's a record at those brokers. You could spend, a couple hours a day all year doing that. You'd still have about 300 left over, right? And that, I think, is a huge problem, right? It's a problem that's sort of gone beyond individual self-management. Now, one of the things that I think is most positive about what was happening in 2014 is that you had both in agencies, senators, private individuals finally grasping this. And there are critical reports that I think showed that recognition. One being the President's report on big data, seizing opportunities, preserving values, which I think was a very helpful overview of the new challenges raised by big data in the new economy. Another was a report by Pam Dixon and Gellman called the Scoring of America. And in that report, for example, one of many highly inflammatory, sensitive data gathering and scores that they revealed was one of a data broker that was selling what they called a rape sufferers list. Okay? So they were sort of keeping track of people who had been raped and selling those names to whoever might want those names. There are also lists at these companies of people who are assumed to have or attributed to have bipolar depression, diabetes, cancer, dementia, incontinence, impotence. You name a medical condition that someone might feel sensitive about, these data brokers have a list that has people on that particular condition. I think personally that we are within, say, a few years, perhaps certainly no more than a decade, where if things continue to be unregulated, you will be able to go to some data broker and simply give them someone's name, and they will be able to give you their best guess as to their medical conditions, and their best guess as to their income, their best guess as to their credit score, et cetera. And as more and more data is shared, those so-called best guesses are going to be a lot better than guesses. They're going to be based on nonstop, computerized surveillance of each moment of that person's life on the internet, as a consumer, as someone that buys, and frankly, given cell phone data, simply as someone that moves around with a computer emitting sensory data about them all the time. Now, we had concerns raised both by the FTC in their data brokers report and by Senator Rockefeller in his own report from a Senate committee on these types of issues. I think the bottom line of all of these areas is that essentially all of them really question whether notice and consent and whether individual control is in any way a plausible model. I would say, just to boil down all of the arguments I've made so far against notice and consent as a model, is that it presumes phantoms, which are the opportunity to negotiate terms of contracts. So if I were able to write into Facebook and say, Facebook, I'm comfortable with you keeping a digital profile about me with respect to all the books I read and the songs that I watch, but I'm not comfortable with you keeping a medical profile on me, or knowing exactly what type of medical conditions I may have had, or selling information about, say, my political views. If we lived in a world like that, where we could bargain like that in one-off contracts with large platforms, then notice and consent would make sense. We don't live in that world. If you tried to do that, even if you were to offer them thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars, you wouldn't be offered that bargain. It's kind of interesting to think about areas where we usually assume it's all about the market, it's all about voluntary free contracts, where even the most basic rights of negotiation are gone. A second choice is that there's no real choice of provider, so some people say, well, just leave Facebook, leave Google, leave Amazon, et cetera. To some extent you can leave, but on the other hand, if I were to leave Google right now after having used it for 10 years and having effectively trained it as to what I'm interested in for 10 years, I've lost a huge amount of investment in the service itself. So we're kind of stuck. We're kind of stuck in, moreover, a lot of these big platforms change the terms, change the rules over time, such that, you can trace, for example, Facebook, what they default to being public or private, what they default to using or not using over time. Those changed over time. We've all are into bargains that we could never really have anticipated. Now, how do we start getting a grip on this new scenario? Well, one of the areas that I think is really critical is to start revitalizing the concept of sensitive information, right? To the extent, and in terms of sensitive information, there was a recent study by Solov and some other scholars who looked at, in different countries, what was considered sensitive information and what was not, such that it got additional regulation. And of course, healthcare is way up there. Religion and political opinions are somewhat up there. You can sort of see the list about different types of classifications that should be treated with different levels of sensitivity. I think it's critical that we start breaking out the type of data and the type of profiles that these big firms are generating about us. That's sort of a first step. I'd also note, by the way, when you talk about sensitive data, even within healthcare, health privacy has many different rules about data such as the data of minors, mental health data, genetic information, and substance abuse data. All of those are treated somewhat differently within health law. So we already have a privacy regime, such as in health, that has that type of granularity in terms of how it treats different types of data. It's time to sort of be working along those lines in the broader data sphere, because as we all know from the Duhigg story in the New York Times, someone like Target can see if we're pregnant. And more companies, they can tell if a woman is pregnant or not, by and large, via their big data stores in terms of who's coming to their stores. These types of health inferences are becoming more and more common. And I think that sort of a fundamental analytical tool that should be used here is that we have to start developing categories about, first of all, correcting data that's out there about us. I talk about in the book a woman who has been pegged by a data broker as having been a meth dealer. She never had such a charge, but it had huge ramifying consequences throughout her life. And because there was a centralized data broker that had that charge about her, it distributed that data to several smaller ones. Even when she corrected it at the central one, she was unable to correct it at the smaller ones. So the problem becomes that if you've got a data sharing infrastructure that is, to use a term from Ralph Nader in the 60s, defective by design. If you've got defective by design data architectures that are essentially enabling incorrect smears of individuals to disseminate and to be promulgated indiscriminately throughout the files of other companies without having an architecture of correction, that's defective by design. That just shouldn't be out there. And I would also echo Elizabeth Warren, who at one point stated, you can't buy a toaster that has a 1 in 5 chance of exploding and burning down your house. She extended that to loans and said we need a whole new agency, essentially, to make sure that your loan doesn't have a 1 in 5 chance of bankrupting you. I would say that we've now reached a point where there's a critical mass of people who are being smeared by incorrect information thanks to a data architecture that is defective by design. And we've got to start correcting for that. I'd also say that there are areas where certain data is inappropriate to be used. So, for example, we now have lots of laws that say someone can't simply decide not to hire you on the basis of your being sick. That's a disability, and that form of disability discrimination is wrong. But we are so close to a world in which data brokers and data analysts can take a sort of 360-degree view of someone's data and can, within that data, heavily weight, say, information about that person's health status, then launder that information in a multivariate score, a score with it may have literally thousands of variables, and say, this is likely to be an expensive employee. This is likely to be an employee who will leave after 2 years. Now, if we live in a world where essentially that sort of health information can be laundered through big data algorithmic processes and ultimately end up in scoring that is going to be affecting critical decisions, that again is a way to sort of magically arbitrage around, or at least, it's not magic, to mathematically arbitrage around all manner of discrimination and other laws. And it's a very worrisome world that we're entering in. So we have to make sure that when scores are used, that they're not being based on sensitive data like health status, that they're not being based on sensitive data, even I would say, like political views, Okay? I think we're very close to a world, too, where people could be characterized as quote-unquote radicals if they happen to deviate too far from, say, a Democratic or Republican perspective. If we have scores out that are based on this type of attribution, we have to be really sensitive about their use in an employment context. And I think following on lots of legal scholars, we have to demand that all of the data and all the algorithmic processes behind those are open to inspection by the people infected. If we don't have that world, we're essentially putting up a giant white flag that says, use these processes to get around any law you don't like to big business. Okay? Now, what are the stakes furthermore? Okay, you might say, well, that's a rather speculative problem, right? These sort of scores that are out there. Well, one example I would give from just last week is that China has decided to essentially score all of its citizens as a governmental matter. So I highly recommend looking into exactly how far that's gone, even from a governmental perspective. But from, say, a private industry perspective, we already have evidence that there are folks who, say, for clinical trial recruitment, can use data that is as disparate as whether someone has a big car or not, whether they have a big cable package, and whether they have children. If they know that, for example, the person has a big car, a large cable package, and no children, they will attribute to that person a much higher proclivity than the average citizen to be obese, okay? Now, and there are all sorts of stories you could come up with to justify this about, say, maybe they need a larger car, because they're a larger person, et cetera. But I don't really care about the post hoc rationalization. What I care about is that data, you may never give a second thought to the fact that your choice for a cable package could influence, say, a health characterization of you down the road. But it could, and it could be all doing that secretly. What I think, what we are on the verge of in that type of world is one where stigma, the type of stigma that social theorists like Irving Goffman and others have looked at and sort of explained the consequences of in so eloquent detail, that could affect people in so many parts of their lives and they'd never even know about it. I'd also say that some folks will say, well, we just need to allow people to buy help from industry to, say, repair their credit, or to repair how they look online in this new digital world. I've put up stills here from an ad from a company called creditreport.com, which I think is a subsidiary of one of the major credit bureaus, which essentially had a utility worker who said because he had a 580 credit score, creditors considered him lazy. But with the help of creditreport.com, he could reclaim his name, Stan, okay? And I highly recommend watching this and also watching the ad Lisa/unreliable Lisa, who's apparently unreliable because she has a 590 credit score. What we're seeing, I think, is you have a characterization by industry that this is just a game, and if you know how to play the game, you can essentially recover your name, et cetera. What I can tell you is doing the research for the book was one thing, and it documents so many examples where people can't really repair their reputation. But after I published it, I would say nearly every week I had a story from somebody who had a problem. I mean, people who took on major lawsuits to help others in what were clearly fraudulent practices, and then they lost at one stage of the case, and then they had one order against their name, and that wrecked their credit score for years. I mean, there's so many examples where even in the regulated, relatively transparent world of the three major credit bureaus generating FICO scores, there are huge problems. But we're now in a world where there are 4,000 of these entities that could be generating scores on people. So it's a really, really new, harsh problem, a huge problem, and we have to think about whole new ways of dealing with it. One thing to note is that this guy, poor Stan, was called lazy because of his credit score. All of us now are susceptible to having totally secretly attributed to us a fraud score, how likely we are to be frauds. A frailty score. So this is used, for example, in a health context, but it's not hard to see how it could escape from its native context and have some problems for people outside of that. Health scores. This is also used, there are extant data brokers that have actually been penalized by the FTC for generating these scores and not allowing people to understand their basis. Non-standard credit scores, say based on how many friends you have on Facebook, or whether you buy chrome thrusters for your car, bad credit sign, or whether you buy felt tips for the underside of your furniture, good credit sign. Okay? These are new scores that are out there. Youth delinquency scores and tenant scores. By the way, one tip to folks, if you want to keep your tenant score up, probably a good idea never to sue, scratch that, probably a good idea never even to challenge your landlord. right? So we have to also realize how all of these scores, they're not sort of symmetrical. It's not as if we live in a world where the tenants are rating the landlords and the landlords are rating the tenants in this totally fair symmetrical process. A lot of times there are folks who are already marginal and they are being really slammed by scores that are essentially either opaque or unchallengeable. Okay? And there are real power differentials out there. Yes, there is some landlord rating, but it sort of pales in comparison to some of the impacts that these other scores are having on more vulnerable populations. So one of the things that we often also hear here is that if there were any regulation of the flow of data, that this might violate the First Amendment. And this is sort of the First Amendment bugaboo. This is something I look at in my book. I actually think that the First Amendment threats to regulation here are wildly overstated, or at least ought to be wildly overstated. You can never predict exactly what the Supreme Court will do. But my view is that essentially, if you look at the disclosures that I'm trying to recommend here and about the restrictions on uses of data, not on the collection and analysis, but on restrictions of uses in these narrow contexts of employment, health, insurance, real estate, et cetera, that these are essentially not dealing with sort of speech, they're not dealing with expression, they're not dealing with knowledge, they're dealing with power. And I think that's a really critical thing. And we also have to say that the more we have information forcing disclosures about these types of new scores and big data type ranking and rating, the more information we're creating. It's not about blocking information, it's about generating more information. I also want us to be quite aware that it's technically feasible. Sometimes we hear from folks that are very well-meaning who try to have what I call a premature realism about regulatory proposals. They say, well, if we were to try to get our head around this new industry, it would just overwhelm the entire agency, or it would be incredibly hard. I think healthcare has shown, though, that we have these type of similar safeguards that I've been calling for in this talk. They have been implemented in another sector. The question is just how many resources are we going to demand, right? We have, under high-tech, under HIPAA, and I'm happy to talk about this further in questions, we have ways of understanding where data comes from and where data is going to. And we could get to that level of tracking data, of understanding its importance in the larger data broker community if we devote the resources. I also think that healthcare is an excellent precedent here because of the role of the states in working with HHS in sort of a collaborative, coordinated manner in order to make sure that health privacy is vindicated. I think we could also see similar types of collaboration in lots of other areas on the federal, state, and even municipal level. So I think that finally, some final points to make about regulating data use in the future is that consumers deserve to access all of the data used to make critical decisions about them, okay? We can't continue to live in a world where black boxes are rendering incredibly important judgments of people, which are essentially a digital star chamber. We've got to move beyond that. I'd say also that some data should not enter into certain decisions. We've got to make sure that to the extent scoring is increasingly used in employment, health, insurance, real estate contexts, the information about people's health status, and perhaps also information about their political views, information about their ethnicity, information about their gender, all these things aren't somehow being laundered into a score. We have to be really careful about those sorts of things. And my final point today will be that essentially if we don't regulate big data-driven decision-making, that's essentially an open invitation to technical arbitrage around anti-discrimination law and all sorts of other laws. The laws really mean very little if we simply focus on analog, older methods of sort of implementing sharp business practices or troubling business practices. We've got to update them. We've got to bring them into the 21st century. And I think that having a 21st century agenda for data, which is being pioneered by groups like Center for Digital Democracy, by groups like PIRG, by the activists we're going to hear from, and also being elaborated by scholars, I think that this effort is essentially critical to making sure that we don't have sort of a world of real space that is like the world of law and a world of online space that is essentially rendered lawless and uncontrollable. Because as more and more decisions are made in this sort of cyberspace realm, we're going to essentially see the relevance of regulation is totally dependent on its ability to also enter into the cyberspace world. So with that, I thank you. Great. Thanks.
Are there any questions?
I'll ask a question.
Let's come back to the beginning.
I think this is also for the regulator panel, but This is now.
Could you identify yourself?
This is Jeff Chester, Center for Digital Democracy. This system now of autonomous, ubiquitous data collection and analysis seems to me is now the basic business model in the world, right? Yeah. Everyone is doing it. Data brokers now, Fortune 1000 companies, they're data brokers too, right?
Yes.
All right, so what do you think can be done? What should be done, in addition for calling for regulation, given the fact that there's such a difficult political climate, to address this world where the system of generating revenues is all dependent on, in essence, the collection of data and the manipulation of consumers? What else can be done, should be done?
So, I mean, that is a terrific question, Jeff, and I think that the one, just to ground us, first of all, in some of the history of the efforts of the agencies to get their hands around the problem, I believe that one of the issues that was stifling the FTC's earlier regulatory pushes in the area was the definition of a data broker. So, I mean, I've been to conferences where they would talk to, there would be a question from the audience from a commissioner, say, and they would ask, how do you define a data broker? And it's a relatively easy regulatory problem if you say, look at the 9 data brokers that were subpoenaed in December of 2012 to get information that ultimately became the foundation for the Transparency and Accountability Report, right? It is a much harder question when you start thinking about the role of data in, say, Google, Facebook, and not just those companies, Walmart, Target, et cetera. I think that one of the things that we have to start realizing, and this is also builds on my work with the Data Competition Institute, which I think is doing some really important jobs in competition policy here, is that there is the critical nature of data in business decision making has got to be understood. And folks have to understand throughout, I think, the regulatory and the academic community that there's this sort of centripetal pull whereby the more data you have, the more the data you have is worth. Okay? And that's really raises the stakes because you're going to have very big companies continually merging or sharing or swapping, selling data to get better and better profiles about both their suppliers and their customers, both ends of this spectrum. And the winners there are going to have incredible advantage over the losers. And I talk about winners not just in terms of they'll have competitive advantage vis-a-vis their competitors, they'll have incredible advantage in terms of pricing power vis-a-vis suppliers, and in terms of finding what Nathan Newman calls pain points for consumers. They'll know so much about you, down to your income, down to your wealth, down to where you live, down to what you've bought in the past, that they can think of essentially the highest price to charge you such that you won't run fleeing to another place, right? And I think that when you think about the stakes being that high, then essentially what you've got to start doing is you have to start, first of all, saying, how do we redefine fair consumer practices in a world where there is such an information asymmetry? One of the first steps toward that is to start breaking down that asymmetry and giving people a right to say, inspect, correct, annotate, pull out, do things with their data that are at these companies. But another example, though, that I would say is to limit the sale, limit the transmission, and to force built into any sale or transmission of this data automatic functionality for correction, annotation, and inspection, such that, if someone is selling a profile about me and it's got fundamentally incorrect information about it, I don't have to worry about just correcting that information with that company. I also automatically, when I do it there, it gets corrected everywhere, right? But I think the other point of this has to be that we have to really start making sure that inappropriate data is not being laundered into these scores. And that's going to involve a lot more transparency from the decision makers using the scores. So the question of privacy, and this to get to I'm sorry for a long-winded response to this answer, but I think this is really the critical shift that we have to make, is that being a privacy advocate nowadays doesn't mean just thinking about the data at companies that we think usually of as threats to privacy. What it means, I think, even more importantly is how do you create transparency about the use of that data so that you can find inappropriate uses, right? I mean, I'm sure everyone in this room would be outraged if you found out that there was a score that was out there being used by employers that essentially built into it some attribution of people's mental health status based on their social media updates or other things. And by the way, if mental health status can be attributed via these sorts of public traces of ourselves online. I mean, it's a matter of this science has been developed. Look at Project Durkheim that is used by the VA. Look at all these other sort of projects that essentially use large-scale linguistic corpus analysis to attribute these very sensitive inferences about people. Sexual orientation, mental health status, drug use status, all these things can be attributed. And I think that essentially what we have to start doing is we really have to start getting the transparency on the corporate side, and that's the necessary first step. And my bottom line would be, any company that is part of this big data economy has to be able to tell a relevant regulator and an affected data subject where they got their data, about that subject and in general, and where that data is sold off to. That can't be accepted as a trade secret anymore. And to the extent we accept that as a trade secret, we basically have to give up on regulating this entire economy.
Great. We'll take one more question, and then is my mic on? Can people hear me? That after this question, Frank will be joining as a respondent to the second panel, so there will be an opportunity for more questions.
Hi, I'm Scott Klinger with Center for Effective Government. Has the possibility of allowing consumers to sue people who are purveying incorrect information about them on the table at all? It seems to me like the current situation is that we have to be responsible for our data being correct rather than the company that's collecting it. And if we reverse that through giving people the right to sue for major damages like loss of job or missing out on a house or those kinds of things, that might turn the tide.
Absolutely. So that's a terrific question. And by the way, great to see CEG here. I'm a big fan of your work. And my sense is that essentially that is open to people that have egregious problems that somehow are so egregious they become transparent to them. So, for example, when I mentioned the question of the person who is mistakenly attributed to being a meth dealer by one data broker, I mean, finally, some entity told her, look, the reason we're not giving you even credit to buy a dishwasher is because you've got meth dealer on this secret report that we've gotten about you. Okay, and I think that's one way. But the problem that I think is more fundamental, that I think in a way is really vitiating the power of attorneys to sue here, is that a lot of this stuff is secret. So, if you've got a secret attribution about you out there, a lot of employers now, they don't have to tell you why they didn't hire you. They don't even have to tell you why they fired you. A lot of insurers, they don't have to tell you why they're charging you so much, in many of these contexts. And I think that is that's why I think that the paradox now of current privacy law is that in order to protect individuals' privacy and their integrity, reputational integrity, and ensure fair data practices, we have to get a lot more openness and a lot less corporate privacy about the use of data in these scenarios. But yes, there are people like Joel Winston. I know some attorneys that actually have developed practices in the area, and they're doing good work. But it's just hard for a lot of them to even know the scope and extent of the problem. The other issue, too, by the way, is that the way that U.S. courts calculate damages in these cases is extremely restricted, right? It's really hard to get damages. Whereas you see in Europe, you have a much more, I think, fair-minded and realistic assessment of damages that I think recently came up with a case involving Google in England. And so I think the European precedent is something that is perhaps ideally going to get legislated by states, or perhaps by some forward-thinking states. That would really help. The only worry I have, though, in terms of state regulation is we have to really watch out for misuses of or expansions of the Dormant Commerce Clause, because you're seeing all over the place when a state tries to sort of do something that I think is a relatively creative solution in these areas, then you get pushback, constitutional level pushback that says, oh no, that creates an incoherent or inconsistent regulatory regime, and that's going to be problematic. So that's something that is I think on the longer term horizon. But I think in general, yeah, that's a really important, making sure people understand more of what's going wrong and getting at real remedies. That's going to be the key.